Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3, middle of page 1456. We finished the paragraph on 1456. Let's sum up. So we're talking about the soul statement. The soul below declares to the souls above, I am dark but beautiful. And even though I'm darkened by this world, by being manifesting in a body and an animal soul, but I'm beautiful. And who is the neshama directing those words to? The neshama below is speaking to Bnei Yerushalayim, the daughters of Yerushalayim, complete reverence. They stand in complete bittul to the divine, means they're not dark, because they don't have the body and animal soul. This is the neshama says they are in Atzilus, in a pure state, like he said, bittul betachlis and yira shalom, not just yira tata, which is bittul of yesh, of hayesh, but bittul of mitzias, total absorption and completely being sublimated in the divine. Yira shalom. Yira comes from a state of riyah. That's why Avraham Avinu said, he called the place Yira, Yera'eh, because this is where God appears. The vision, the sight, the appearance is connected to Yira, like he explained on the bottom of page 1455. Within he said there as well that Yira's gematria Yaru, the first three letters of Yerushalayim, is Yira. And he brought the Shem Ab. So I did look it up. As a matter of fact, it was posted, I think Yitzchak posted it, yes, on our group, where the sources for it. So it was correct that I said Shem Ab, but the key thing to remember here is that Shem Ab, as I mentioned yesterday, the three verses in the chapter by Kriyas Yamsuf, by Yita, by Yisa, by Yet. So each of these three verses, all talking about when the Jews traveled, and then they went out, Vayet, and then Moshe lifted up his rod when the sea parted. Each of these three verses has 72 letters. So 72 times 3 is 216. So the Shem Ab is correct, is one aspect of Shem Ab is how that name is formed. But there's another aspect to it, or maybe it's another aspect of Shem Ab in general. The bottom line is that Shem Ab has 72 letters and 3 verses, and that makes for the 216, which is also the gematria of Yarut, 216. And the apparent connection is because Ab is in Chochmah, and as he said, Chochmah is Riyah, and Riyah is connected to Yira. Like he says it. So, and Gvura, which is also the left side of Yira, is associated with Gvura. Av is associated with Chesed. That's also the gematria of 216. So just coming to emphasize more this level that we're describing of Yerushalayim. But it's not just Yud Reish Vav Yira, it's also Shalom. So Shleimus HaYira, which is the bittul b'mitzias that comes from seeing something where you get completely hypnotic, completely mesmerized, completely absorbed in it. So that is the neshamas above, and that's who the neshamas below are speaking to. Now, this level doesn't exist by Nivraim. They don't have Yira b'Shleimus, because they don't have that level of complete absorption. Even Malachim, most of the Malachim, like we said, Malachim Yosim Ta'ala, that the Eibishter reprimands them. So in other words, they reproaches them rather. So they also, you see, don't have complete Yira. Because they don't have the Gili Mahusa Atzilus. We know the Malachim are already in the world of Biy'a. And for sure, Nivraim don't have it. So who does have this level? That's the level of Yerushalayim. Malchus of Kedusha. This is Malchus of Atzilus, which is Elikus Mamish. That's Shleimus HaYira. And why does it have it? Because there, in Atzilus, radiates the Ha'ara, the reflection of the Kav, the main artery of godliness, the main conduit of the Kav, radiates Gila Mahus, B'chol Shel Atzilus, also in Malchus. Abba is nested in Atzilus. Abba, the level of bittul that we're talking about. Yirei Allah, Abba Chochmah, is nested in Atzilus, also in Malchus. And in general, that's Pnimius Malchus. And that's the Shleimus Hayira. And therefore, Neshamas, Kamesh Ein Lamaila, the souls, the way they are above in Atzilus, they're called B'nai Yerushalayim, the daughters of Jerusalem, of Yerushalayim, because they're also in that state of Shleimus Hayira, like Atzilus is. So just like Atzilus, and it radiates the core Kav, or actually say the reflection of the Kav radiates the core of Elikus, the Muhus of, Muhus, who bechinas Gilead Muhus, B'chlol Selim Atzilus, right? So out of the Kav, a reflection of the Kav, but it's Gilead Muhus of Elikus, and that's in the Neshamas as in Atzilus, and therefore also the souls of Atzilus. Then he broke it down even further, that this is primarily in the souls when they're still, as they're absorbed in Atzilus, which is the state of Ibur. So now he distinguishes between two levels in the Neshamas of Atzilus, as they're in a state of Ibur like pregnancy, where they're part of and one with the mother, and they eat what the mother eats. So they're all part of that original source. So the same thing is the Neshamas of Atzilus in a state of Ibur. So he explains that just like there's, so he says, Al derech moshla uber bebetna emari uber yerachime. It's like one of its limbs of the mother, and it's sustained. It's sustained by what the mother eats. So it's literally directly. You could say, I don't want to say IV, intravenous, but it's directly linked straight into the core of Atzilus. Then, but afterwards it becomes a separate entity. So same with Neshamas of Atzilus. When they are in a state of Ibur, the Neshama is encompassed in the Pnimius Kalim, the inner containers of Malchus, completely like one thing with the source, like a fetus is one with the mother. And also it's sustained from the Ha'aras HaKav, it's sustained, the Ha'aras HaKav, you can say it is like similar symbolic here of the umbilical cord that is directly feeding straight from the mother, from the source. Because the neshama is now an extension and a part of in the state of Ibur. And when the Nand comes stage number 2, Leidas HaNeshamas. When the Neshamas are born, they become a Biy'a b'fnei atzma, they become a separate entity. B'hus mitzias davar b'meichenu b'midis. So they still retain, they're obviously a divine soul, but now it's a separate from Malchus of Atzilus, from the mother. Yotzav and Nifreda from Malchus, like a Vlad shenivdal mi'imei. So it's now separated from Malchus as the Ageres HaKedah says, that it's distant from the Kav. In Ibud, it's not distant from the Kav, it's feeding straight from that tube, so to speak. Now it's separate. It's still a neshama of Atzilus, but now it's in a state of birth, a state of Gilead. He doesn't say it's Chitzenius Malchus. He can still say it's a state of Atzilus, but it's now as a separate entity. And the Yotzuv Nifrudu Ma'kelim Shem Hamed Kamen. So, and that's Neshamas Atzilus stage 2. When Makolsh came, then comes the third level, Kamoi Shenasis Neshama Be'elam Biy'a. And for sure, as this Neshama becomes a soul of Elam Biy'a, he's but most likely referring to the same soul, but now it's also manifesting Ata Barasa, the garment of Biy'a, as we're going to learn soon. So that for sure makes it even more separate. So what we're getting here is a picture of the actual process of how a soul evolves from a more connected state to becoming a separate entity, and will come into this world. And in this world, we know ultimately Biy'a, Yetzir, Asi, and then finally in this world of a body and an animal soul, Bishcheirani. That's where the soul will say dark, but will say I'm dark. But right now we're talking about the soul as it is in Atzilus, is B'nai Yerushalayim. That's the primary level of Ibur. Later is already beginning the separations, beginning to become a separate entity, like a child after birth. And that's where we stopped. So now we're going to continue. He's going to explain this in more detail, these levels of the soul in Atzilus, and then as it starts moving outside of Atzilus, or separate from Atzilus. Yeah.
Can you take a few questions?
I said this directly links to what we learned in volume 2 at length, where he spoke, as I said yesterday, two parts. One is connecting Atzilus to that which is higher than Atzilus, and the second is connecting Atzilus to that which is lower than Atzilus. In other words, bringing the divine also after the Parsa, after the partition, and after the Tzimtzum, is the part where you start talking about the soul as it starts descending and becoming a separate entity. Atzilus, even though Atzilus is not Etzem, because it's a world, but it's Iyu v'chayu echad, like we said, it's complete alakus mamish, mahus alakus. And therefore the souls in Atzilus have that experience. But the kavanah, of course, is that the souls come down further, not just Atzilus, but they go down to Biy'a, Yitzir, Asi, and ultimately down to this lowest world. And here, that they reveal the divine, as we all shall learn, that they ultimately not only are beautiful, but they have resources that will be revealed dafka below where it's dark, but that we haven't reached yet. Now we haven't discussed that yet. So right now we're still middle of the discussion of the stage of the neshamas of Atzilus, B'nai Yerushalayim, in the verse, and we'll come back soon to what the neshamas below are speaking to this level of B'nai Yerushalayim. The next paragraph he's going to explain. So I hear you may want to have questions. I would advise that maybe some of these questions may be answered in the next paragraph, but I'm happy to take question. And if indeed it is, I'll defer to once we learn it inside. Okay, go ahead.
So let me try, and if you have to defer, that's fine. So first of all, I'm curious to understand why the Rebbe Rashab here says that the location, if you will, of these pure neshamas, Benos Yerushalayim, is in Dafkin Malchus of Atzilus. Now, is it because of the inyan of Bittles? Because Malchus gives birth to the lowest realm, which yields, which will give birth to the neshamas that come down into Biy'a? That's my first question. He just says it. He doesn't explain why. He says, "B'chinas Yerushalayim shehi b'chinas Malchus de Kedusha," which itself is a corollary. The first question: what's the difference in Malchus and Malchus de Kedusha? I understand it's complete godliness. That's question one. Question two is, I thought that the ultimate source of the shamas were from whence they come, if you will, is the Tachton Shalabora, which is really the very, let's say, the lowest part of Atzilus, if you will. And then we say the shamas are chelika kalma malmamish. So now maybe you're going to say, okay, it's Atzilus, often the klalius of Atzilus, which is higher. Maybe that's your answer, but I'm confused about that apparent inconsistency. And well, I had a third question, but I'll leave it with the first two.
So first of all, Yerushalayim is the level of Malchus, like Knesset Yisrael. In general, when you speak about Neshamis and Atzilus, you're talking about Knesset Yisrael. And Knesset Yisrael is always Malchus. So wherever you talk about Neshamis and Atzilus, you're talking about Malchus. That's the general statement. Malchus, remember, draws from all the 9 spheres above it. So the Neshamis of Atzilus have, obviously, Chachma in them, and Bina, and Das, and all the way down to Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Chod, Yisod. But its primary location of Neshamis is in Malchus Atzilus. That's the level of Yerushalayim. And here, B'nai Yerushalayim, which only emphasized, because Bas is also, he doesn't mention it here, but it's the Makabel of Yerushalayim. But that's just the general level where Neshamis are. And that itself is the distinction between Ibur and Leda. That's regarding point number one. Point number two, you asked this question before, and I think maybe some others have also. So you have to keep in mind that in general, when we speak about the worlds, we say Neshama Nesata bi Tahirihi every morning. What level is Tahirihi? Is it Tachtena Shebe Maitzil, or is it Atzilus? And why doesn't he refer to both? The answer is because generally speaking, we talk about 4 levels: Atzilus, Biy'a, Yitzir, and Asiya. Generally, we speak about them in the context of the Seder Shtalshlus. Like I said, unless he spells out otherwise in Chassidus, he's talking about Atzilus. The Atzilus that we are familiar with is Atzilus, the Protis, basically. And that's the level that's considered to be a level that the Alter Rebbe himself couldn't even say the word Atzilus. He would tremble. That's how difficult it was for him to say it. We don't have this issue, so for us it's easy to just throw around before the Tzimtzum, after the Tzimtzum. But generally speaking, we're talking Atzilus is a very extremely high level. Say a neshama of Atzilus, Moshe Rabbeinu is a neshama of Atzilus. A Rebbe is a neshama of Atzilus. So that's rhetorical, but the neshama as it's manifests in the whole cosmic order, it says neshama of Atzilus. Most neshamas are called neshamas of Biy'a. You may recall Zera Adam, Zera Behema, two different types of souls. Neshamas of Biy'a refers to Biy'a Yitzir Asiyah. They also originate in Atzilus, but they also assume the properties and the levushim, the garments of Biy'a Yitzir and Asiyah. If you look in Tanya, chapter 2, where he begins and says that the Nefesh Hashem is B'Yisrael, the second soul, is a Chelika Alakam Mal Mamash. If you continue reading the chapter, it doesn't stop there. He says that's where it's rooted. Then he says, Chelika Alakam Mal Mamash. Why is it Chelik? So he says like a child from a father, that it comes from Etzem Moyecha, from the very genetic material. Bonim Atem LaHashem Alekechem. And explains that's the level of Chochmah. So suddenly from Chelik Alakam Mal Mamash, he goes into Chochmah. Same chapter 2 in Tanya. Can't be a contradiction, because the answer is the neshama travels. It's rooted in the chelik alakam mal mamish, but then it travels through chachma, and then from chachma he continues and speaks about the distinction between different souls. He speaks about the Talmidei Chachamim, the scholars, the Amaratzim, the simple souls. He speaks the difference between souls that come from the head, souls that come from the akfayim, from the heel, even from the nails. So remember, a soul, there are many souls in this world. There are generally 600,000, but they break down into many more details. So both are true. They're rooted in a very high level, but then as the soul manifests through the worlds, it goes through the worlds, it assumes the properties of each of those worlds. So in general, if you look back, I think I referred to it several times. On the bottom of page, let me just find it. Yeah. Bottom of page 1454. Something he repeated many times. If you go back and learn the previous pages in Ayin Beis, where he talks about the two levels of a soul. You recall, is soul higher than Torah, or is Torah higher than a soul? And he answered, there's two levels in the soul. There's the soul that's higher than Torah, the soul that Torah is higher than the soul. And he speaks about the soul as it is in its root, and then how the soul comes down below. That's when it needs the support of the Torah. That's the whole discussion of the Oir Hariyah, that even though we see with our eyes, but we need the light that supports it. The light originally is the light of Torah. So he speaks about two aspects of the root of the soul. If you look on the fifth line, from the bottom of the page, he said, "Mitzalas Malas and Neshama the Shorshan ba'Atzilus." So the root of the souls is an Atzilus, and then he says right after that, "V'sheir Shorshan," and the root of the root, whom b'mchinas asmos ein sof. So this is a contradiction? No, you're talking generally. You're talking about the root of the souls is an Atzilus. If you want to start breaking it down in detail, then we go to the root of the root, and that's Atzmos ein sof. That's before the Tzimtzum. Which, yes, we call that Atzilus the Klolos, or even higher than that, Helema Atzmi. So this is a general picture of Chassidus talks about everything that below is rooted in the higher worlds. Depends which worlds we'd be. Usually we talk about Atzilus because that's the main, we'll call the main landing page, if you wish. That's the landing platform where everything happens because it's already in Seder Ishtalshlus, it's after the Tzimtzum, it's after Ak, Akudim, Nekudim. Atzilus, as we learned, is a structured world of 10 spheres, Hiskaulus. It's a fully functional world. Higher than Atzilus, we learned, is 10 energies in one container, or if even 10 energies in 10 containers, but they're not balanced. Atzilus is the world that we talk about as being the complete divine world. So the root of the souls is there. Then from there they'll go into Biy'a, like we're learning here, through Malchus of Atzilus, and then further down. If you want to go, where's the root of the root? Then you go into Atzilus the Klolos before the Tzimtzum in a far more subtle level, because there's no structured world. There's no 10 spheres. This is what we call the hidden spheres, which he said clearly are not even spheres. They're just a name that we use. It's God envisioning existence. But in his envisioning, there's also subtly also a level where Yisrael Ola b'machshava, that the neshamas arose in God's machshava, lifnei atzimtzum, And that itself goes all the way, all the way to what he called Tachteina Sheba Maitzil, the Yachid, the level of Yachid, the spark of the divine that becomes the spark of the creation. Explained that earlier, Tachteina Sheba Maitzil, which in a lower level would be like Atik, which is Tachteina Sheba Maitzil, compared to Arich, which is the Reish HaNetzalim, the beginning of the emanations. So you'll find throughout Chassidus the discussion of like a hologram, microcosm, macrocosm. Everything repeats itself. However, it's not repeat of the same level. It's always on the higher subtle levels as you go higher upward. And so here the main focus is Atzilus and Biy'a. That's the connection. B'nai Yerushalayim, you don't usually word B'nai Yerushalayim, you'll not talk about before the Tzimtzum, because there's no Yerushalayim, there's no B'nais, there's no levels altogether there. There is simply God envisioning it. And yes, we were given a gift where the Rabbeim teach us and give us a little glimpse what's going on in a reality that says that existence can't even exist before the Tzimtzum. That's why there was a Tzimtzum necessary, because there's no room for existence. That's the words of the Arizal. But nevertheless, Chassidus gives us a glimpse to what God is thinking about, so to speak, or how he's envisioning it all. What do we speak about? Is we speak about where God actually created existence. That's after the Tzimtzum. And that's Atzilus. That's where the neshamas operate out of. And as they say, they manifest in Atzilus. Atzilus, there's Ibur. There they're connected and fully absorbed. Yira Shalom. And then from there they go to Leda, a state of birth from Malchus of Atzilus, and then they'll go down into Biy'a, which we're going to learn now about more in detail. So that's a general picture. And as I always point out, this is not mathematics and not mechanics. It's a subtle understanding that all levels below originate higher levels. And most of us, frankly, would have difficulty even explaining how all this is Nasir Ruchnius. Even talking about Atzilus is already quite a high level. But it's words. The truth is, if you explain that Nasir Ruchnis would be quite a level as well, because the souls are spiritual. We're material human beings. We think in terms of materialism. We think in terms of empirical and tangible and concrete things with our senses. So the real truth is, on a level where we're at, most of us are barely beginning to scratch Asir Ruchnis. So Atzilus is already a very high level. And if you're talking about before the Tzimtzum, you're talking about a level that's really beyond us, definitely from Aveda. We could talk about it, because Chassidus definitely talks about it, but we have to also understand it's not the level where we're at. And we're not even at the level of Atzilus. Moshe Rabbeinu was a neshama of Atzilus. That's the level we're talking about, the highest neshama ever existent. Now, but however, we still talk about it because subtly we all have the four levels. Tahirihi at the neshama shenasat be tahiri. Subtly, like I always explain, relative to each one of us, we can find these levels, but you have to find it. To really appreciate this, it's finding the Atzilus within yourself, so to speak, the tahirihi, and then recognizing how that moves to Biy'a, Yitzir, and Asiyah. So basically, in simple English, the Atzilus within each of our souls is that level when you feel most connected. Like you feel like a child in its mother's womb. Exactly right. When you feel connected to that extent, those moments where you feel completely absorbed by godliness as much as possible on our level. And then there's the rest of the day. Some people during davening, that takes place at least for a moment, or Yom Kippur, or Elul, or other times of the year, or special moments. And then there's when we go to work, where we can't say we feel that type of connection, but we still try to draw from it into our Ata Barasa, Ata Yitzarta, Ata Nefachtabi. So that's what we're ultimately, I think, the best understanding of it, if you think about it, about your own life, as you see your neshama in different stages or different states. That's the best way to really understand this. Okay.
Thank you. That was amazing. Very helpful. Thank you very much.
Is this the first time you or everyone here hears this explanation?
No. You just integrated it. You brought a lot of things together, and it's complicated stuff. So it's helpful.
No. I have no problem going over it many times. That's not the question. I'm just wondering if what I said was heard before by anybody. That's what I was.
He said most of this yesterday.
Okay. I have said it many times. I'm not complaining. I know these ideas are complex, and you could say it 1,000 times. That's not what I'm addressing. I just wanted to know Try to understand where you're at. You know what you're
no,
hearing.
No, you have said it before a number of times. I've never heard you integrate it like you just did in the 15, 10. But yeah, no, of course I've heard you say these. Like you've just connected about 12 or 14 or 15 points, and I've never heard you do it all at once. That's all.
Okay, no, fine. And also listen, sometimes I could have said this exactly in the past, and still it takes a few times, and then you hear it again and again. So again, I know these topics are dense and very subtle, and they are on topic. I'm not discussing now, I'm more resistant when we start talking about things that are not on this reservation. What we're learning, but this is essentially exactly what we're learning. So I'm more than happy to elaborate on this as much as we need to internalize it. If you go back, I would say at least the last 50 pages, you'll find a lot of what I just said is there. It just, there's a lot of material that we've covered, but the pieces are there where he talks about these levels. And obviously, when you learn it, you start identifying these key lines, like the one I just pointed at the bottom of 1454, which I think is vital. Sharshe and Sharish Sharshe. So you see clearly the Rebbe Rashab is sensitive to the two dimensions here, how it is in Atzilus and how it is all the way in the highest levels. But if you go back, the more you learn it, frankly, the clearer it gets. Okay. So let's continue learning now, right? New paragraph. Page 1456, the paragraph of Inyan Hu. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. So he says like this now, Inyan Hu. What Inyan are we talking about? He's talking about the souls, B'nai Yerushalayim. He spoke Ibur, Leda, and then how it comes into Biy'a. So he's going to discuss now that process. Being that he gave the example, and I use the example very often, as you know, of the fetus, pregnancy, birth, and the process of one entity being born from another. So you see right here, God gave us a gift. By looking at how children are born, you have a good example of how God creates existence and how neshamas are born. So that example is a very one that most of us can identify with, even though we don't know all the mysteries of the process. But we definitely understand the process of conception and then development and the gestation process and the first trimester, second, until finally a child emerges. But that idea that a child is part of its mother and then it becomes a separate entity, he's now going to explain in the language of Atzilus and Biy'a in context of the process, how souls move downward from higher levels to this world. So he says like this, but
before you say, interesting enough, yesterday with the muscle of the mother, there's really also 3 stages there. That's why there's a hetero certain times to do an abortion if the child is like a rodov, and that's before birth, and there's the stage at 40 days, and then there's a stage later, so it fits in perfectly with the 3 in this time. I really like it.
Yeah, I mean, he does. Where do you see 3 here? I'm not sure. You mean the 3 of Atzilus?
Biologically, we know that. Everybody knows that. There's 3 stages when the heart starts beating around 40 days of cool.
Okay, fine. Yeah, but where do you see 3 stages in spiritual level? You're talking about Ibur, birth, and Biy'a? That's what you mean?
You're talking. You mentioned, as you mentioned, at the time of not Atzilus. What was the word or in Sof, that the highest one. Then you're talking the second one in Atzilus, Malchus of Atzilus, and then you're talking. Yes, okay. It's even more perfect than you expressed it yesterday.
Yeah, but remember, before the Tzimtzum, you can't talk about Ibur. You can't even talk about a pregnancy. You just talk conceptually, God envisioning it all. But okay, I hear what you're saying. So now let's continue. Va'inyan hu shar yesh hefresh ben Atzilus leBiy'a. There's a difference between Atzilus and Biy'a. Gam leBiy'a. I'm sorry. Gam lebchinas Atzilus sheba Biy'a. Okay, so there's obviously a difference between Atzilus and Biy'a. They're two different worlds on two different dimensions. But he's saying even more so, even Atzilus on its own, compared to Atzilus as it manifests in Biy'a, there's also a difference. So there's a few words about that. Here you see another example of what I mentioned, the overlap and the Iskalus. Even though it's four dimensions, Atzilus, Biy'a, Yetzir, Asiya, but we've learned many times there's an Atzilus within Biy'a, there's a Biy'a within Atzilus, there's Atzilus within Yetzirah. I mean, even mentioned earlier that Chachma of Atzilus is Mekanna, nests, and Atzilus. Abba, Ima, Bina of Atzilus, nests, and Biy'a. Mazah of Atzilus, nests, in Yetzirah, and Malchus of Atzilus, nests, in Asiya. So the point being is that there's Atzilus and Biy'a, but there's also Atzilus Sheba Biy'a. And Atzilus of its on its own is higher than Atzilus within Biy'a. And what is the difference? He says like this: Shariyesh Mosach Mavdil ben Atzilus leBriy'a. This is why I was referring to back in volume 2. There's a Mosach, there's a curtain that separates between Atzilus and Biy'a. And this earlier was called Mosach, sometimes it's called Parsa. Basically a partition. This is a key element. This was a central theme in the middle of volume 2, when we were speaking from the Torah of the Magid of Aselach Hashtecha Etzetzres, and also in volume 3, that there's one thing bringing Galakus into Atzilus. So it's true, it goes down to Atzilus is a structured world with spheres and so on. And Atzilus is infinitely distant from the levels higher than Atzilus. But the leap from Atzilus to Biy'a is even a bigger leap. Because now it's going to the world of Biy'a and it's going through a curtain. It requires a partition. Mosach Mavdil ben Atzilus leBriy'a, which of course therefore indicates that there's a difference between them. Or else why would you need a curtain to separate or a partition? V'akav. Remember, we're talking about the kav. The kav, think of the kav as being the feeding tube, if you wish, or the artery, the conduit, in many names for the kav. A kav literally means a line, but it's like a line that carries the divine energy from higher levels to lower levels. And it's the kav that shapes all levels, because the kav is like a line. So there's gradations of and a hierarchy of higher and lower, as we've learned as well. So he says now this kav, which was, like you said earlier, that the neshamas, when they're in a state of ibur, in pregnancy, they directly feed from this kav. When they become separate from the mother, from Malchus of Atzilus, they don't. They're meruchak from the kav. They're separate from it. They have to eat on their own. Maybe the mother still feeds them, but it's not directly a direct line straight into the mother's feeding tubes. Let's put it that way. Okay. So v'akav hanimshach me'erein sof meir b'chol elam Atzilus ada Parsa. So when he said,
You're breaking up on us, Rabbi. We can't hear you.
Before, if you recall, on line, you said?
We can't.
Oh boy.
We lost you a little bit. You came back. Maybe it's okay now.
Feeding
we lost
tube.
you for 10 seconds. I lost you.
Okay. So we said earlier that the kav radiates. The words he used were, I just want to follow the whole words. It said like this. 1 minute. Where's the line? Ha'aras hakav shemer ba'atzilus, in the klolos elam atzilus. So he's saying now like this: the kav hanimshach me'erein sof meir b'chol elam atzilus ada Parsa. The kav we were talking about radiates, illuminates all of Atzilus until where? Until the curtain. Now you see interchanges Mosach and Parsa. So you say Mesachim, Parsois. The truth is it's the same meaning. It's just one is Hebrew, one is Aramaic. But basically it's the curtain. So he says the kav radiates all of Atzilus till the Parsa. V'sham mistayim ha'oir. And by the Parsa, the oir comes to an end. It stops flowing after that, stops radiating. The Ayin Beis and does not radiate in Biy'a, mipnei haparsa mafsekas, due to the partition that separates them. So think of a partition. The light is shining through your window. That's not Atzilus. But if you put up a curtain, the light, and it's a dark curtain, a pay curtain, or at least then the curtain does not allow it to flow through. Just 1 second, please. Give me a moment. Okay, sorry. So when there's a curtain, a curtain that doesn't allow the light to shine through, so that's the curtain that stops the kav from radiating into Biy'a. So here you see the distinction between Atzilus and Biy'a. Now, to say that it completely nothing shines at all, you can't say. Something does radiate, because Biy'a is still a world, and it has a world of revelation. It's not a completely dark world. So he says, and that which does illuminate or shine through the curtain, that's called a reflection of a reflection. So if there was no curtain at all, it would be direct light, and you wouldn't have any filter. Here it's a ha'ara da ha'ara. That's what it's called. Shehi ha'ara nivdelas. So the way Atzilus explains it, it's called a separate reflection. Even though a reflection is a reflection of the original, but conceptually it's now taken a leap. So even though there's a light, but the light has been diffused through the curtain, which turns it to like an infinite distance, a paradigm shift from the core light as it is in Atzilus. So that's the process that happens between Atzilus and Biy'a. It's very similar, we learned in volume 2, to what happens to the Tzimtzum Arishin on a more macrocosmic level. It's actually far higher. The Tzimtzum Arishin is even deeper concealment. But it's the same idea, conceptually speaking, that you need a paradigm shift. You need a quantum leap from Atzilus to Biy'a. So to say no light gets in, it's not, no light passes through, you can't say. But it's what he calls a aron nivdala shebe'ein harech, be'etzem ha'er, the way it is in Atzilus. We're going to get back to understanding how this is in context of Bnei Yerushalayim and Ibur and Leda. But let's see how he explains it, and then we'll elaborate. Okay. Any questions on what we just learned? It's not finished. He's in the middle of the discussion. But just for any clarity purposes, any clarity on what we just learned, or it's clear? Okay. Furthermore, he says, V'gam mashamer eir lehedya b'b'kiyas Parsa. And that which also, in fact, lehedya means like, ultimately, in fact, there is a radiating of light. The Biy'a Parsa, when it penetrates, but Biy'a means like it pierces through the curtain. Just want to see what the song should be like. I'm trying to see where the sentence begins and ends. 1 second. Yeah, it's along what the light that pierces the Parsa, the curtain. Did it break up? Did it break up again?
Yes, your bandwidth is low. You're choppy.
Okay, we're back to that.
Yeah, but we can hear you. You're making. I mean, we can hear you. There's nothing that's breaking up your articulation that bad.
Still
Yeah,
intelligible.
I just don't want it to get worse. Okay.
It's funny. As soon as you started talking about the Parsa, your connection got bad.
Okay, that's the Parsa right there. Yeah. Okay. V'gam hashemer lehedia b'bkiyas Parsa, and also with that air that in fact lights radiates is it pierces the Parsa, and that's called Atzilus shebeBiy'a. Because remember we said before there's Atzilus, there's Biy'a, there's Atzilus within Biy'a, which means that something from Atzilus is going into Biy'a. It's just not the way it is in its pure, pristine, undistilled form in Atzilus. V'hainu, b'chinas hakelim de Malchus. What level is this? These are the containers of Malchus. Shenasim naran leBiy'a. This is a famous expression from Eitz Chaim that the Chassidus brings quite often. We've read it a few times. And what is it saying? That the kelim of Malchus, of Atzilus, so we learned before the Pnimius HaKelim, that's where the Neshamas are in a state of pregnancy. They are absorbed and they're connected to Atzilus. But then these kelim of Malchus, they become Naran, Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, leBiy'a. They become the Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama of Biy'a. So this is now Atzilus as is becoming the spirit, the three levels of Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama in Biy'a. Sometimes it says the 30 kelim of Malchus of Atzilus, which is 3 times 10. The 3 spheres in Malchus times 10, which 3 is another discussion, but the 30 kelim of Malchus of Atzilus become Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, because each of them is 10. Nefesh has 10 faculties, and Ruach has 10, and Neshama has 10. That's sometimes the way it's spelled out. Here he's just saying it in general, that the kelim of Malchus of Atzilus become Naran of Biy'a. That's Atzilus as it radiating in Biy'a that pierced the curtain, which he called before Ha'ara Nivdelis. It's a quantum leap. It's a paradigm shift of a leap of the light. Shezeh b'chinas Elikuz Atzilus. That means that some of the Elikuz, the godliness of Atzilus, has pierced the curtain and manifested itself in Biy'a. Umavur b'Geras HaKedesh sham, and as explained in Geras HaKedesh there, section 20. The Geras HaKedesh she quoted at the end of last paragraph. Shemeir behem gam irakav. That in these kelim of Atzilus, as they go into Biy'a, there radiates in them also the irakav. But that's not a contradiction to what we learned, because the irakav, its core light, stops by the curtain. What comes afterwards is only a nivdelis, and he's going to qualify that now. He says, Mekol Mokim, even that part that does pierce and make it through the curtain to the other side of the curtain in Biy'a, Mekol Mokim ein zeh k'may gilui irakav shemer b'Atzilus. It's not like the light of the kav as it radiates or shines in Atzilus. U'kamoshin is bar le'il, as was discussed earlier, and he gives us Vahi Bayem Hashmini, Dibra Masl Vahi Bayem Hashmini. That's in volume 2. Yeah, that's where he talks a lot about the Parsa. The Kalim Atzilus Kameshanim Shachim Biy'a. We learned there that the containers of Atzilus, as they transmit and flow into Biy'a, Nasim B'chinas Ribi HaKelim, they multiply. The Kalim begin to multiply Ribi Kelim, many Kelim, V'umir ta'ir, and the air in direct proportion to that gets diminished. In other words, as the light is stronger, the Kelim are less. As the light gets weaker, the Kelim get more, or the other way around. As the Kelim multiply and become more Kelim, the energy that flows in them is more diminished. So you see from this that even though the light is shining, but now it's changed. It's changed in the fact that the light is more withheld and therefore more kelim. Think of a teacher who's teaching an advanced student. He doesn't need that many words because he can give the idea over in a few words. But if it's a student that is a lower level, then he has to diminish the light and bring many more words and many more examples and many more details to explain it to him. So essentially, as Atzilus moves into Biy'a, that's what's happening. So he said a few things. Let's sum it up. That they're different. There's a curtain between them. What does the curtain do? It stops the core light, and that which comes through the curtain is only a ha'ara dehara, reflection, a separate, like a leap, a quantum leap or a paradigm shift. And that too is an Avdelis, and it's infinitely distant from the core light. And even that which shines is not quite like the Eirakav. And he brought now from the Maimon Shmini in volume 2 the difference between being more light or diminished light and more kalim and less kalim. Now he's telling us to look in the Maimer afterwards. After Shmini, a few weeks after that, there's a Maimer Adam Ki Yiyah, also in volume 2. Actually, it's the Maimer right after Shmini, I should say. So right after Shmini, Adam Ki Yiyah, to look there as well. So basically, in those two Maimorim in volume 2 discusses the difference between Atzilus and how Atzilus goes into Biy'a. So you see here definitely a descent of a diminished level of the energy. Any questions before I continue? Okay, it's not finished. More to say. V'gam, and additionally, in explaining the difference between Atzilus and Biy'a. Yes, Atzilus. There's another aspect of this difference. There's also this difference. The Atzilus ha'er b'chola esesphiris. Kishem b'skalus v'sargus. That in Atzilus, when the red light shines, it creates iskalus and isardus. Iskalus is interconnectivity and unity. If you may recall earlier, we learned about Atzilus that it's really like one body. It's like one organism. You don't see distinctions. It's not the sum of the parts. Yes, it has 10 spheres, but they all are focused on that one coordinated unit. So he's saying, so in Atzilus, the Eir, in all the spheres are in a state of iskalus, interconnectivity. Iskalus means there's Chochmah within Bina, Bina within Chochmah, etc. And Isachdus, and unity, and union. Mashenkin kishinim shachim b'Biy'a. By contrast, when Atzilus, when this energy goes into Biy'a, harizel madreges protis. It comes now into specific levels. Meaning the focus is more on the details, not on the overarching or the undercurrent that connects them all. Like I've given an example many times. Let's go back to the example of pregnancy, actually. In earlier stages of pregnancy, you can't distinguish between one limb and the next. Later stages, the body begins to develop into details. That's in pregnancy. I don't want to use that example because pregnancy is still in Atzilus. But just as an example, the same idea as in anything. When you talk about the architect building a building, so there's a point where the vision and the blueprint encompasses everything. But then when you start delegating the work to each team and to each worker, their focus is on the details. Their focus is not on the whole picture. So he's basically saying that another difference between Atzilus and Biy'a. Obviously, it's dependent on the difference that he mentioned earlier. But he's spelling out more differences between Atzilus and Biy'a as far as their levels, which of course is going to help us understand how neshamas experience different things in Atzilus and Biy'a. Okay. And Biy'a, I should say, he's using Biy'a. First he started with Biy'a, he's talking Biy'a now. Harizela madreges protis. And he's going to explain this further. Val derech sha'amar. Similar to what we say. So there's a statement of Chazal, famous statement. Akol be'asora shkinta sharia. Wherever there's 10, the shkina rests. The idea of a minyan, when you have 10, the shkina rests, when 10 people come together. He brings this in Tanya, he brings it many places, but it's a Maimer Chazal. that the Shekhinah, now the Shekhinah is there all the time, obviously, but with 10, there's a synergy that draws down a particular Shekhinah level of Shekhinah. Even though one individual, you also have the Shekhinah dwells there. Like we say about the Mishkan, that v'shachanti b'seicham, I will dwell among you, and it says b'seich kol echad ve'echad, within each one of you. It doesn't say you need 10 people to be a Mishkan to Hashem. One person is already a Mishkan. Kol echad ve'echad. Liyesha kol echad ve'echad u'chelik elakah. Because every individual is a piece of the divine, as we learned in time. So what does it mean when 10 are there? The Shechinta Sharia, she says, Ach zeu derech prat. When you say each individual, the Shekhinah rests, that's in a derech prat, when you're speaking on a specific level, in detail. That the Shekhinah then is radiating to that particular spark, only of this neshama. So this neshama is experiencing the Shekhinah. The Gamshu Tzadi Gomor. And also when he's at Tzadi Gomor, he's a complete Tzaddik. The Yachid B'Deireh, and a singular individual, an exceptional, outstanding individual, Yachid B'Deireh, a single Yachid B'Deireh, one in a generation. K'moish K'nishmas Moshe, like the neshama of Moshe, Hagam Shohaya Neshama Klolis, even though he was a Neshama Klolis, which means he encompassed all the souls, but in the level of Moshe, Mekom Mokum Hula Atzme Yachid. Hula Atzme on his own, he's a Yachid. He's still an individual. To have a minion, one Moshe cannot make a minion. You need 10 people. So even though Moshe has a Neshama Klolis, his soul was an encompassing soul, but as an individual, he was an individual. So this is true. In other words, this point that we just made, that the Shekhinah v'shachanti b'seicham b'seich kol echad ve'echad radiates to each individual on his level, that also includes Moshe Rabbeinu, even the highest person. He has a divine manifestation in his neshama. Nevertheless, Makol Mokim, something happens when there's 10. Ba'asara dafke Shekhinah sheira. But nevertheless, the Chazal say, it's when there's 10, that's when the Shekhinah will dwell. B'shum da ba'asara dafke shem neged eser spheres da Atzilus. Because when you have the 10, which correspond to the 10 spheres of Atzilus, b'tzir k'ema shlema, in a complete full structure, sham sheira klolos erein sof she'ebe eser spheres da Atzilus. That's when you have another synergy that's not there, that each individual soul has on its own. So like in Biy'a, you could say each individual soul has, obviously the Shekhinah as well, but there's something happens when you have the 10, which draws the synergy, the synergetic effect of Atzilus, Atzilus, the Iyu v'chayu echad, because you, Hashem, and your energies are one. Hashem is one with these 10 spheres. So in other words, when you say 10, the Shekhinah rests in 10 is like a Gili of Atzilus. The Shekhinah rests in each individual is like a Gili in Biy'a. Doesn't say that explicitly, but that's essentially what's implied here. So in other words, he's bringing that example to distinguish that the Shekhinah, yes, goes into each individual, but in Atzilus, there's also the Iskalus and the Isachdus that he said. There's the synergy, the unification that happens that's higher than what we have in the worlds below it in Biy'a. Interesting example that he gives for this. Okay. Okay, let me stop here. Any questions? Let me stop for questions.
So is he saying here that one of the aspects of a minyan, like davening in a shul, that a minyan is so critical is that you're essentially reformulating, in a sense, like the Elikus of Atzilus, because you have 10 neshamos, and somehow by collecting 10 neshamos, you're essentially I don't know, I'm not finding the right the right verb, but you're reestablishing or simulating Atzilus in a way. There's more elikus between and amongst the 10 than if there were 9 or just one alone. Is that
before we get to Atzilus, just understand the concept of synergy. That 10 is not just 10 units. There's a qualitative shift when you have all 10 because you have the synergy. It's like the example given, it's going to give it soon. The Eira El Al Kolona, when you take, for example, a word like Baruch. So Baruch is made up of Beis, Reish, Vav, Chaf. As individual letters, they're all holy letters, but they don't have the meaning of blessing, of bracha. When you bring them together, a synergy enters, which is more than the sum of the parts. That happens when you get them all. The same thing is when there's 10. When 10 neshamas come together, 10 souls, they have a synergy that is added, which brings the shkin to shari. That's what Chazal say. That's on a very basic level without just understanding what the power of 10 is. So the power of 10 has an additional quality that enters. In the language of Chassidus, that is drawing down the 10 spheres of Atzilus, where you have that synergy, which you don't have in the individual levels of Chachma, Bina, Das, and so on in Biy'a, where, like he said, there it's Madregas Protis. There the focus is more on the detail. Atzilus, you have that synergetic effect because all the spheres, like he said, are Hiskalus and Isachdus. That's the key thing with 10. Remember, the 10 have to be together in a group. It can't be 10 people from by Zoom or 10 people distant from one another. They have to come together in one environment. And that's what creates that synergy. That's the drawing Dava Atzilus. Yeah.
That's despite what it says in Perkei Avos about 3 people together, 2 people, 1, and that they also use the
different
word
synergies. Yeah, that's Mizuman has an element in 3, but 10 is the real number that you hear about. Then there's also opinions that when you have 100 people, you actually change the blessing. Not everybody holds by that opinion, but there's an opinion like that too. For the record, the Alter Rebbe brings in the Igeres HaKedesh that when 10 Jews come together, even if they don't learn Torah and they don't daven, it also has the synergy. And of course, how much more so when they daven and they learn. Okay. I think we're going to, I'm just want to see how far he's going to go here. Okay, I think we should stop here because the next section is a little more dense and needs a little more explanation. I don't want to just leave it hanging in the middle of a sentence. I think it's a good place to stop. He's going to continue discussing the quality of Atzilus, and then you want to know when he's coming back to where we are, then he's going to open the Kav. Well, it goes for a while, actually. Yeah. But around the third down, the next page, he's going to start going back to Leda and Ibur and connecting it all to what we're learning, B'nai Yerushalayim. But the flow is pretty straightforward. He's essentially talking how from B'nai Yerushalayim, from the Shamas and Atzilus, what happens as it comes down into Biy'a, which is now after the Parsa. So this is, thank God, the Rebbe Rashab could have relied on what he said earlier in volume 2 and 1. He is spelling it out relatively more at length than usual. So that's helping us understand and connect the themes. Okay.
This phrase, I think you said it, but he comes and says it in the next sentence, Ha'or ha'ola al kulana, is the synergistic energy that is sort of the sum of the whole is greater than the parts. The 10 have a certain energy that's greater than any of the 10 combined individually. Is that the phrase you used in explaining some of this?
I use that phrase, but he's going to use it here, I think, even on a deeper level. He didn't use it yet. But it is similar idea. Yeah, the synergy. This is discussed. He's going to refer, I think it's discussed in volume 1. There's a whole section there in the early part of volume 1. She's boily ill, yeah. I think it's somewhere in around chapter 19, 20, in that area, where he talks about it more at length. It's like the example I gave with the letters. When you combine letters, that's the example of Eira El Al Kolona. So I see he's gonna bring it, and we'll soon. We'll do that tomorrow in the next class. So meanwhile, we've covered to some extent the difference between Atzilus and Biy'a, different number of differences, to understand essentially the difference on the souls, their consciousness and their perception, the difference between their perception from one level to the next. And as I said, next page is going to come back, not leaving us hanging. This is all going to tie up very beautifully. Yeah, I see. Ibur, Leda. Another good 3 pages, another page or 2 of this discussion. And of course, we're going to come back to what about the souls below that say, Shreirani, I am dark, but beautiful. We haven't gotten to that yet. We're now talking about souls that are not quite like Atzilus, but they can't say they're dark yet. They are quite illuminated, except it's a lower level of illumination as we're learning here. It's really very eloquently presented. I see it's going to go step by step how neshama comes downward, which of course also teaches us how we can climb upward on the ladder. Yeah. Okay, we'll stop here. 3 lines from the bottom of page 1456.